It had started like any other morning, the sort of ordinary day where nothing remarkable seemed poised to happen. The sun was just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting soft beams of light onto the kitchen floor. The faint sound of the shower running in the background was a gentle reminder that my wife, Emma, had started her routine. I shuffled into the kitchen, half awake, rubbing my eyes as I tried to shake off the grogginess that always seemed to linger in the early hours. It was still early enough that the world outside felt slow and quiet, and I relished these moments of calm before the busyness of the day took over. I glanced at the kitchen counter, where my wife's phone sat, face up. It was buzzing, the vibrations humming softly on the surface. A few stray hairs were scattered across the screen. Emma had a habit of leaving her hair ties and bobby pins everywhere. The phone's screen was lit, and the notification bar at the top showed a new message. Normally, I would have paid no mind. It was her phone, after all. I had no reason to suspect anything unusual. But for some reason, that morning, my curiosity got the better of me. The phone buzzed again, this time with a few rapid, almost frantic vibrations. It was strange. Emma was meticulous about turning off notifications when she wasn't around. Why hadn't she silenced it? A tiny voice in the back of my head began to whisper, nagging at me, urging me to just glance at the screen. It felt harmless enough, I told myself. After all, I was married to this woman. Our relationship was built on trust, wasn't it? There was no harm in a quick peek. I walked over, hesitated for a moment, and then picked up her phone. Holding it in my hands, I couldn't help but notice how familiar it felt, almost as though it was an extension of her. The screen was cracked slightly on the top right corner, a mark from the time she dropped it a few months ago. I didn't mind the cracks. They felt like a small imperfection, one that made the phone feel more real, more hers. I unlocked it without thinking. We had been together for years, and there were no real secrets between us. At least, that's what I thought. I had unlocked her phone plenty of times before to check the weather or send a quick message when she was busy. There was nothing inherently wrong with it, or so I thought. The message at the top of the screen was from an unknown number. The name didn't ring a bell, at least not immediately. "Hey, I miss you. When can we meet?" It read. For a moment I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The words stared back at me, seemingly innocent but loaded with implication. I read it over once more and then a second time. My breath felt caught in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. I could feel the weight of the message settling in my stomach, a knot tightening as my mind raced to make sense of it. The words were casual, almost playful, but the familiarity in the tone was undeniable. Who was this person? Why would they send such a message? And why hadn't Emma mentioned anyone by that name before? I immediately glanced around the kitchen, as if somehow expecting to see her there, standing in the doorway, watching me. I put the phone back down as if it had burned me, feeling suddenly embarrassed by the intrusion. She was still in the shower, unaware that I had picked up her phone at all. The room felt strangely quiet, the hum of the shower filling the silence. The phone screen went black, and the gentle vibrations ceased. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, trying to steady my breathing. Part of me wanted to forget what I had just seen, to go back to pretending like everything was fine. But the other part of me, the part I didn't want to acknowledge, was tugging at me, urging me to dig deeper, to find out more. I felt conflicted, torn between my desire for answers and my rational understanding that this was likely nothing to be worried about. I thought about Emma. I thought about how loving and dedicated she had been to me. We had a good relationship, or so I thought. We laughed together, we supported each other through tough times, and we had built a life together. We had plans, dreams for the future, and an unspoken trust that we both valued above all else. What I had seen on the screen, just one message, after all, was hardly a reason to jump to conclusions. But then again, why hadn't she mentioned this person before? Why was the message so intimate? It was all so confusing. I shook my head, trying to banish the thoughts from my mind. I wasn't the type of person to dwell on things like this. I wasn't jealous, I wasn't paranoid, and I didn't want to become the kind of person who searched for problems where none existed. I placed the phone back on the counter, trying to ignore the strange sensation gnawing at me. A few minutes later, Emma walked into the kitchen, her towel wrapped around her body, her damp hair falling over her shoulders. Her face lit up when she saw me standing there, and I tried to smile back, but it felt forced. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, an awkwardness between us that hadn't been there before. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm, as she reached for the coffee cup I had set aside for her. "Morning," I replied, my tone betraying the unease I felt. She noticed the tension in the air, and her brow furrowed slightly. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, my thoughts running in circles. I could feel my hands shaking slightly as I took a sip of my own coffee, trying to clear my head. I didn't want to confront her, not yet, not without knowing the full story. But that single message, those 4 words, had opened a door in my mind that I couldn't shut. "I'm fine," I said, perhaps too quickly, trying to brush it off. But Emma, ever perceptive, didn't seem convinced. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in my expression. "You sure?" "Yeah," I said, shaking my head. I don't know, just tired, I guess." She smiled sympathetically, not pressing me further. "Well, you've been working a lot lately. Maybe you should take it easy today." I nodded, but in my head, the words from the message kept repeating. I couldn't help it. "When can we meet?" As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A creeping suspicion lingered in the back of my mind, one I hadn't asked for, but one that now seemed impossible to ignore. I found myself thinking about that message at random moments. When I was in the shower, when I was having lunch, when I was sitting at my desk. I couldn't focus on anything else. What if it meant something? What if there was something I was missing? I kept telling myself to relax. It could be nothing. It was probably nothing. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding or an innocent comment between friends. But the nagging doubt wouldn't go away. And that was the moment everything shifted. It wasn't just the message itself. It was the fact that I had let curiosity take over, that I had invaded her privacy in the first place. I had crossed a line I didn't even know was there. As the hours passed, I became more and more consumed by my own thoughts. The simple act of picking up her phone, something I had done countless times before without a second thought, had opened a door to a world I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The following days were a blur of normality, but beneath the surface, everything felt different. I had told myself I would brush it off, that the message on Emma's phone was no more than a casual exchange. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The doubts gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't reach, growing more insistent with each passing hour. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The words on that message, "I miss you, when can we meet?" echoed in my head, replaying over and over. It wasn't just the content of the message. It was the way it had been written, the intimacy embedded in those few words. I wanted to dismiss it, but a small, relentless voice in my mind told me there was something I needed to understand. Emma and I had been married for 5 years, and I thought we had built something solid. We knew each other's routines, our likes, our dislikes, and the tiny quirks that made us who we were. I trusted her implicitly. We were partners in every sense of the word, until that moment when I had picked up her phone. That single, innocuous act had cracked open a small fissure in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a momentary lapse in judgment. But the curiosity refused to die down. I found myself constantly thinking about that message, wondering who the sender was, why it felt so intimate, and why Emma hadn't shared it with me. Maybe it was someone from work, a friend with whom she had developed a closer bond. But what kind of bond was the message suggesting? It wasn't just a friendly text. It was personal. Almost too personal. I couldn't help but wonder if I was missing something, if there was more to the story than Emma had let on. The next few days were marked by a tension I couldn't quite place. Emma seemed the same, loving, attentive, and warm, but I found myself overanalyzing everything she did. Every time she stepped out of the room to make a call or send a message, my heart would race. I couldn't help it. The suspicion was like a shadow that followed me around, casting doubt on everything. I began to pay more attention to her behavior, looking for signs of anything out of the ordinary, any clue that would explain the message. But she seemed to be the same Emma I had always known. She was affectionate, but there was no indication that anything had changed between us. It wasn't until that Thursday afternoon, 2 days after I had first seen the message, that I found myself standing in the living room, staring at her phone again. It had been charging on the coffee table, untouched, almost as if it were waiting for me. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should respect her privacy, but the need to know more had become all-consuming. I told myself it was just one more look, just to get some clarity. I wasn't the type of person to invade her privacy like this, but in that moment, it felt as though I had no choice. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling slightly as I unlocked it. The same crack in the top right corner stared back at me, a tiny imperfection that somehow felt more significant now. I opened her messages, feeling a mix of guilt and anticipation. The first thing I noticed was the name of the sender, Chris. It didn't immediately ring a bell. I tried to think back, but I couldn't recall anyone named Chris from her circle of friends or work colleagues. But the longer I stared at the screen, the more the name gnawed at me. I scrolled back through the conversation, my eyes scanning the messages. There were more of them, far more than I had initially thought. The texts weren't just friendly, they were flirtatious, at times even intimate. The words they exchanged were filled with playful teasing, the kind of lighthearted banter that didn't seem to leave room for anything else. But what bothered me was the tone, the familiarity in it. Chris wasn't just a friend. There was something more in their exchanges, something I couldn't ignore. I found myself reading one message over and over. It was from Chris, and it read, "I can't wait to see you this weekend. It's been too long. I miss the way you make me laugh." The words struck me like a punch to the gut. Emma had never mentioned Chris in that way. I thought about all the times we'd had conversations about work, about the people she interacted with, and I couldn't remember her ever mentioning anyone named Chris in this context. It was as though this person existed in a world I wasn't part of, a world I didn't even know she had. I kept scrolling, finding more messages that made my stomach turn. There was one from Emma that read, "I love hearing your voice. I miss our talks." And in return, Chris had written, "I miss hearing yours too. You always know how to make me feel better." These weren't just casual messages. They were intimate. They were words exchanged between two people who had a bond that went beyond friendship. I felt a knot tightening in my chest, my breath becoming shallow as I continued reading. My heart raced with each new message I uncovered, each one painting a picture of a relationship that I had no part in, one that Emma had kept hidden from me. She had shared everything with me before, every detail of her day, every funny story, every frustration. But this was different. This felt like something I wasn't supposed to see, something that had been kept from me for a reason. For the first time, I felt a pang of betrayal. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was nothing, just a harmless friendship. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The messages spoke for themselves. Emma had been confiding in Chris, in ways she hadn't confided in me. It was clear now that this wasn't just a friendship. There was something more, a connection that went deeper than I had imagined. My fingers hovered over the screen, torn between the urge to keep reading and the realization that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I had always prided myself on trusting Emma, on never feeling the need to pry into her private life. But now, it felt as though my whole world had been turned upside down. The trust I had once taken for granted was suddenly fragile, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. As I put the phone back on the table, a sense of dread washed over me. I had gone too far. The trust that had once seemed unbreakable had been shattered in a way I hadn't expected. But now that I knew, what was I supposed to do with this knowledge? Should I confront her about it? Should I demand an explanation? Or should I keep my suspicions to myself, pretending that nothing had changed? But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the reality of the situation lingered. I had seen the messages and I couldn't unsee them. The question now was whether I would confront Emma or let this silent anxiety fester until it became something bigger than it ever needed to be. The hours passed in a haze, the weight of what I had learned settling heavily in my chest. I could hear Emma moving around the house, talking to me as if nothing had changed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was irreparably broken. I had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. The worst part? I still didn't know what to believe. Had I discovered the truth, or was I reading too much into something that wasn't meant to be taken seriously? But as I sat there in the quiet of our living room, the only thing I knew for certain was that the next few days would be filled with questions that I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. I woke up that morning with a sense of dread gnawing at the pit of my stomach. The events of the past few days had left me on edge, unsettled in ways I couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't just the message or the texts that followed. It was the uncertainty, the not knowing what to do with the truth that I had uncovered. Or thought I had uncovered. Every moment since I had read the messages on Emma's phone had felt like I was walking on a tightrope, constantly worried that one wrong move would make everything fall apart. Emma had woken up that morning in her usual way. She was quiet at first, stretching and yawning before getting out of bed. She walked into the bathroom, humming softly to herself, and I could hear the water running as she started the shower. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I thought about the messages I had read, about the flirtation and the intimacy that had felt like a betrayal. I thought about how I had promised myself that I wouldn't jump to conclusions, that I wouldn't let my imagination run wild. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I couldn't ignore what I had seen. And more importantly, I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I got up. The decision made. It was time to confront her. There was no more avoiding it. I had to know the truth, even if the answer would tear everything apart. The thought of the conversation made my heart race, my palms sweat, but I knew I couldn't go on like this. If I didn't say something, the doubt would eat me alive, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could live with that. I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Emma to finish in the shower. I tried to breathe deeply, steadying myself, but every second felt like an eternity. I didn't want to confront her, not like this, but the situation had gone beyond simple curiosity. There was a distance between us now, one I couldn't ignore. A few days of pretending everything was fine wouldn't be enough to patch up the growing rift. When Emma finally came into the kitchen, towel wrapped around her and hair still wet, I was already sitting at the table, my fingers nervously tapping on the surface. She gave me a smile, the same warm expression she always wore when she first woke up, but this time it didn't quite reach her eyes. Something had changed between us, and I could feel it hanging in the air. "Good morning," she said, her voice light, though I could sense a hint of hesitation in her tone. "Morning," I replied, trying to mask the tension in my voice but failing miserably. There was a moment of silence before she sat down across from me. Her eyes searched my face, her brow furrowing ever so slightly as if she sensed something was off. I didn't speak right away. I couldn't. My mind was racing, the words I wanted to say twisting around in my head, refusing to come out. But I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to say something. "We need to talk," I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. Emma's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her face. She put down the mug of coffee she had just poured and looked at me, her full attention on me now. "What's going on?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with a note of apprehension. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The moment felt like it was stretching on forever, the weight of it almost unbearable. But I couldn't avoid it anymore. I had to say it. I saw the messages, I said, the words feeling like they were choking me. Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I could feel her tension mounting, and I knew in that instant that she had already figured out what I was referring to. The guilt was written all over her face. "Please don't," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but I wasn't going to let her off that easily. "Who is Chris?" I asked, the question tumbling out before I could stop it. Emma's face tightened, and I saw her eyes flicker toward the coffee cup in front of her. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers gripped the handle of her mug tightly, and I could see the conflict warring inside her. For a moment, I almost felt guilty for pushing her, for forcing her to confront something that had clearly been bothering her. But I couldn't help myself. I needed the truth. He's just a guy from work," she said after a long pause. "Just a guy?" I echoed, my voice rising slightly in disbelief. She nodded, but I could see her shifting in her seat, uncomfortable. He's a colleague, a friend, she added quickly, as though trying to reassure me, but the words felt hollow. I didn't believe her, not after everything I had read. I leaned forward, my hands clenched into fists on the table. A friend? Emma, the texts. Those messages weren't just friendly. They were personal. Flirtatious. Her eyes widened and I saw her swallow hard. She was trying to process what I was saying, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to come. I could feel the anger rising inside me, bubbling to the surface. It wasn't just the fact that she had been texting someone else. It was the fact that she hadn't told me about it. It was the fact that for however long this had been going on, I had been kept in the dark. I never meant for it to get like this, she said finally, her voice trembling. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't want to hurt you. I laughed bitterly, unable to help myself. Didn't want to hurt me? How could you not think that this would hurt me? You've been hiding this from me, Emma, for how long? How long has this been going on? She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't like that. I wasn't hiding anything. I didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't serious. It was just someone I could talk to when I needed a friend, when I needed to vent. But nothing ever happened. Nothing happened? I repeated, incredulity lacing my voice. Then why were the messages like that? Why were you telling him you missed him? Why were you telling him you loved hearing his voice? She stopped herself, her eyes filled with regret. She seemed to shrink inward, as if she was trying to disappear under the weight of my questions. I never meant for it to go this far, she whispered. I never meant to make you feel like this. I never wanted to betray you. I swear. I sat back in my chair, my mind whirling. Her words, the excuses, the half-apologies. It all felt too little, too late. I didn't know what to think anymore. Part of me wanted to believe her, to understand that maybe she was just confused, that maybe this had been an innocent mistake. But the other part of me, the part that had seen the messages and felt the weight of her betrayal, wasn't so easily convinced. Do you love him? I asked, my voice rough, my heart pounding in my chest. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the struggle in her eyes. Finally, she shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. No, I don't love him. I love you. I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out and tell her that everything was okay, that we could work through it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I could. The trust that had always been the foundation of our relationship had been shattered, and I didn't know how to put it back together again. I don't know if I can just forget about this, I said, my voice hollow. I don't know if I can just move past it. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you. I wanted to scream, to tell her that everything had changed, that this moment had broken something inside me that couldn't be fixed. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, feeling numb, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I need time, I said finally, standing up from the table. I need time to think about this. Emma didn't try to stop me. She didn't say anything more. She just sat there, her head down, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her own guilt. I walked away, not knowing what to do next. The days following my confrontation with Emma were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. It was as if we were living in a parallel universe where everything around us seemed normal. Emma was still going about her daily routine, still making coffee in the mornings, still humming while she cooked dinner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. It was like trying to walk through thick fog, knowing something was there but not being able to see it clearly. The house felt different. The conversations we had, once full of warmth and familiarity, had become strained, awkward, and polite. We no longer spoke as freely as we used to. There were no more spontaneous moments of laughter, no more inside jokes. Every word between us felt like it was weighed down with the unspoken knowledge of what had happened, and the tension between us was palpable. Emma kept apologizing, over and over. She would send me messages during the day, her texts full of heartfelt regret, promises to make things right, and assurances that she had never intended to hurt me. But no matter how many times she apologized, it never felt like enough. Each time she expressed her remorse, I felt a little more distant, a little more disconnected from the woman I had once known so intimately. The hardest part was when I tried to talk about it with her. I had tried to have calm, rational conversations, but every time I opened my mouth to ask questions or voice my concerns, I found myself consumed by emotion. Anger, sadness, confusion. Nothing came out the way I wanted. The questions that had once felt so clear in my mind now seemed impossible to ask. I wanted to know the truth, but each time I tried to dig deeper, I only felt more lost. Why had she hidden this from me? Why hadn't she told me about Chris earlier? And most painful of all, why had I been the last to know? These were questions I couldn't answer, not without answers from her. At night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, restless. The silence between us was suffocating. I thought about what Emma had said during our conversation. The way she swore she didn't love Chris. The way she insisted it had all been a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But I couldn't help but wonder if that was really the case. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a minor slip-up, an innocent mistake. But something deep inside me, some instinct I couldn't ignore, told me there was more to it than that. I knew Emma. I knew her better than anyone. And I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me. The messages I had read were too personal, too intimate to be dismissed as harmless. There was a connection between her and Chris that went beyond friendship, and I couldn't ignore it. What troubled me the most was that she hadn't confessed it to me, hadn't come to me with the truth on her own. Instead, I had stumbled upon it. It was as if she had been hiding part of herself from me, part of our life together that I hadn't been allowed to see. One afternoon, nearly a week after our conversation, Emma suggested that we go out for a walk. It was a rare sunny day, and she seemed determined to make things right, to find a way to bridge the gap that had opened between us. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what it would accomplish. But at that point, I was willing to try anything. We walked in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts, the city humming around us. The breeze was warm, the sound of birds chirping in the trees, but the air between us felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. "I know you're still angry with me," Emma said quietly, breaking the silence. "And I don't blame you for that. I don't know how to make it better. I want you to know that I regret everything. I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't reply right away. There was too much to say, too much to process. It was as if I had been walking through a fog for days, and now I was trying to make sense of everything. I looked at her, at the woman who had once been my best friend, my partner, and I saw someone I didn't fully recognize anymore. "Do you really regret it? Or do you regret getting caught?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She stopped walking and looked at me, her expression one of hurt but also understanding. She didn't get defensive or angry. She just looked at me as if she had been waiting for me to say it, to voice the suspicion that had been lingering between us. "I regret it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I regret letting myself get that far with someone else. I never wanted to be in that position. I never wanted to hurt you." I looked away, my throat tight. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that it was a mistake, that she had learned her lesson and was truly remorseful. But deep down, I knew that the damage had already been done. The trust that had taken years to build had been broken, and it was something I wasn't sure could be repaired. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," I said quietly. "I don't know if I can keep pretending everything is okay." Emma's face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of her regret. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out, taking my hand in hers. "I understand," she said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I just want you to know that I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. If you can't forgive me, I'll understand, but please, don't give up on us." Her words hit me like a wave, washing over me with a mixture of sorrow and love. I had always known that Emma loved me. I had always known that she cared deeply for me. But love, as I was starting to realize, wasn't always enough. Sometimes love wasn't enough to repair the damage caused by a betrayal, by the erosion of trust that had taken place. "I need time," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I need time to think about everything, to figure out what I want. I can't make any decisions right now." Emma nodded, her lips trembling as she let go of my hand. "I'll give you all the time you need. I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to fix this." I didn't know if I could forgive her, but I knew that I needed to figure out what I wanted before I made any decisions. And that meant giving myself the space to reflect, to process everything. Over the next few days, I withdrew a little more. I spent more time on my own, thinking about everything that had happened, reflecting on the messages, on the secrets that had been kept from me, and on the person I had once trusted so completely. I thought about all the times Emma had apologized, about her promises to do better. But I also thought about how those promises had been broken, and I wondered if I could ever truly move past it. By the end of the week, I realized that I had two choices. I could either walk away from the relationship, accept that what had been broken couldn't be fixed, or I could try to rebuild, knowing that it would never be the same. Either way, I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. That weekend, Emma and I sat down together. I had spent the last few days thinking, and I knew what I had to do. I wasn't ready to give up on us, but I also knew that trust, once broken, was something that couldn't be easily restored. "I want to try," I said, my voice steady. "I want to see if we can work through this, but it's going to take time. I need to know that you're committed to being honest with me, to rebuilding the trust that's been lost. No more secrets, no more lies." Emma nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "I promise. I'll do whatever it takes." And in that moment, I realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be times when I would doubt her, times when I would question if we could ever truly move forward. But for now, I was willing to try. I was willing to fight for what we had. It wasn't a perfect solution, and I knew that the scars of betrayal would remain for a long time. But the hardest part, the decision that would shape the rest of our lives, had been made. We were going to rebuild, one day at a time. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope.